Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're combining the best selling CPU, GPU and RAM on Amazon to see what sort of system you end up with if you follow current system building trends. This is subject to change on a regular basis, but the info presented was correct at the time I started making this video. The CPU is the Ryzen 7 5700X3D, a last hurrah for socket AM4 if you like. Just like the standard 5700X, it has 8 cores and 16 threads, but the 3D V-cache helps to offer sometimes significant improvements over the regular chip. That said, the lower clock speeds may negatively impact CPU specific tests. I remember reading the original TechSpot review which stated that the X3D was 9% slower in the multi-core Cinebench R24 benchmark than its non-3D counterpart. Still, it's gaming where this thing shines, and if you want to upgrade that aging 3600 for example, look no further. For the GPU we have the MSI Ventus 2X RTX 4060 OC. I know, not a fan favourite, but apparently a consumer one. This often trades places with the older and still pretty capable 3060, as well as the 7800 XT, which at the time of recording has taken top spot again thanks to a sale that sees it on offer for £382.50. A solid deal. The 4060 has dropped in price a little since its launch, making it more tempting, but with superior used market options like the 3060 Ti, 3070 and 6700 XT costing similar or less money, this card still doesn't excite me all that much. Pair both of these with 32 gigs of Corsair Vengeance 3200MHz DDR4 and we're ready to start testing. There's no upscaling, or as some may say cheating, involved today, just pure native resolution goodness at both 1080p and 1440p. Apart from the first test because ray tracing. If you want to experience RT, not necessarily in all its glory, you can do so with a 4060. A little help from upscaling will be necessary, but Cyberpunk 2077 here for example, with DLSS balanced, looks pretty sweet. My eyes are constantly twitching as I naturally glance over at an ever increasing VRAM usage statistic though. We're creeping all the more closer to that 8GB buffer with every second. But let's not dwell on ray tracing. I've showcased settings throughout that target at least 60 FPS without the aforementioned help from upscaling at both 1080 and 1440p. I've basically chosen settings that feel comfortable for me, visual options I'd use with this combo. We may as well stick with Cyberpunk here. Throughout this video you'll see the 4060 hitting at least 95% utilisation, which shows that the 5700X3D could handle much more. If you've got the budget, then you could buy a 7800 XT or 4070 Super, just to name a couple, without much concern for a CPU bottleneck. So let's start off with Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p. Now for at least 60 frames per second I chose the high preset. We could have gone with Ultra, which will of course turn a few things up, but there were one or two dips below 60 frames per second. Of course we have FSR off here, and overall we saw 91 FPS. The 1% low was 72 and the 0.1% low was 59. So this gives us a little bit of leeway in terms of that frame rate. There will be moments when we dip to the low mid 70s, and using these settings just ensures that we stay above that magical 60 FPS number pretty much all of the time. At 1440p I dropped things to the medium preset in order to retain at least 60 FPS. 68 was the average here, with nothing else changed in terms of visuals, with a 1% low of 57 and a 0.1% low of 49. It's still a very respectable result in my opinion, considering the 8GB 4060 isn't the favourite amongst a lot of you watching, and that's being generous. The Black Myth benchmark next, 1080p with the medium preset this time around, with 100% resolution scaling of course for 71 frames per second on average. We retained almost 60 FPS as that 1% low, 59 overall, and our 0.1% figure was 54, so it was a pretty consistent result for this benchmark run. When we turn things up to 1440p, well I had to dip to the low preset here, albeit maintaining 100% res, for 61 frames per second, a 1% low of 53 and a 0.1% figure of 47. So still not that bad in terms of consistency. It went pretty well to be honest, but we do have to use the lowest available preset here, and that may be the case with a few more of the latest titles I've tested with this card. For Baldur's Gate 3 at 1080p, we had no trouble in hitting at least 100 FPS with the Ultra preset. TAA was also enabled for an average of 109. Our 1 and 0.1% lows did suffer a little bit, especially in the busy city area here. 62 and 41 were those figures, but I often see a few dips and drops in and around this zone, but it's nothing that puts you off playing this game. It's not a first person FPS, so it doesn't bother me that much, and there's often dips and drops across various hardware. The same can be said for 1440p, where I did drop things to the high preset instead of ultra to retain at least 60 FPS almost constantly, albeit from those percentile lows once again, which this time came in at 56 and 41, so again wasn't bad at all, but noticeable little stutters here and there moving between different areas, but nothing out of the ordinary as far as I'm concerned with this one. I did expect a lot more of a struggle in Starfield, but we managed to retain the medium preset with 100% resolution scaling and of course FSR off. I'd certainly recommend keeping it on for most sub £200 or sub £300 in the case of the 4060 graphics cards here, because it will present some trouble. Not necessarily the card's fault once again, but I don't exactly consider this the most optimized game out there. Nonetheless, with these settings, 68 FPS was the average, in and around a kilo here with a 1% low of 48 and a 0.1% low of 33. At 1440p, with the low preset this time around, I was surprised to see at least 60 frames per second once again, this time 63 on average, albeit with a few more dips and drops. It was noticeably less consistent, but still very much playable with a 1% low of 45 and a 0.1% figure of 27. Outside of busy city areas, when you're just exploring the planets, flying around, that is going to be where this hardware or this card is at its best in Starfield. For Grand Theft Auto 5, this is of course an older game, so I had no trouble with maxing out the settings. Everything was turned up to its respective highest, apart from MSAA, because that just munches the frame rate. So I chose FXAA instead for an average of 161, getting ahead of myself there. We could have probably chosen MSAA as an anti-aliasing option, but it's a bit unnecessary in my opinion, for what it does visually, I think, but it's entirely up to you. 161 FPS was the average with a 1% low of 110 and a 0.1% low of 88. I turned things up to 1440p. Again, every setting was retained, including the advanced options set to their respective maximum. We did see a drop in performance, of course, but we were still seeing at least 100 FPS. 114 was the average with a 1% low of 73 and a 0.1% low of 38. So here things started to suffer a little more in terms of those percentile numbers. Now when it comes to CS2, I usually test with lower options here, because in games like this I don't consider higher graphical presets entirely necessary for fast-paced online shooters like this, but we've got the hardware here and it's capable of hitting decent frame rates even with higher presets. So I stuck with high here. MSAA was off, it turns on by default, so turned it off here for 340 FPS exactly as an average. The 1% low was 157 and the 0.1% number was 95. For 1440p, kept the same settings for a 244 FPS average, a 1% low of 141 and a 0.1% number of 85. So if you have a higher refresh rate monitor and you purchase hardware like this, then you're still going to be able to make use of the higher visual settings. Forza Horizon 5 now with the extreme preset, bit risky here. I should have gone with ultra, although the frame rate on average was absolutely fine. I did start to notice a couple of little micro stutters during busier races, and I think this can be attributed to the 8 gigs of VRAM, which we are close to in terms of usage, as you can see by the MSI Afterburner overlay, pretty much maxing out our card's video memory here. 84 FPS was the 1% low and the 0.1% low was 27, which does indicate a few issues. I actually turned things down for 1440p to the high preset, which made a lot more sense in terms of consistency. 145 was the average, a 1% low of 128 and a 0.1% low of 125. So the consistency levels were brought way back up here, even at this higher resolution, and it was actually performing better than it was at 1080p. Remember though, we have dropped the graphical preset for this one. Now when it comes to Fortnite, If you do select the high preset with DX12, then Nanite and Lumen will turn on by default, so I turn those off here for a much improved frame rate. The resolution scale will also default to 87%, I believe, so I turn that up to 100% for 3D res with TAA. Here we saw an average of 151, a 0.1% low, sorry, a 1% low of 94 and a 0.1% low of 10. This is Fortnite, we usually get a few dips and drops here and there, happens with most of the hardware I test. 1440p, same preset high with Nanite and Lumen off, 100% 3D res with TAA for 92 frames per second. Again, the percentile lows leave a little to be desired, but it was fine for the most part. Finally then, we have Red Dead Redemption 2. I usually go with the console settings, but here I push the boat out a little bit. Ultra textures, everything else set to high. The geometry LOD, or level of detail, was set to max. The grass level of detail 2 out of 10, and TAA was also set to high for 87 frames per second here. The percentile lows were also pretty good. For 1440p, I thought, why don't we just stick to the same settings here, and we still managed at least 60 frames per second, 64 overall. Again, in terms of those percentile numbers, it was still pretty good as far as I'm concerned, though if we want to be a bit more comfortable in terms of hitting at least 60 FPS at 1440p, we could of course turn a couple of options down, and I'd recommend like Digital Foundry's tweaking guide for Red Dead 2. Their console settings are pretty good as well for lower end or mid-range cards. But overall, there we go. The best-selling CPU and the best-selling GPU wouldn't necessarily be paired together, of course, but I thought it would be interesting to take a look at what the performance would be like if we did so, along with the best-selling RAM at the time I began this endeavour. Let me know your thoughts down below. Remember, there are far better options as far as the GPU is concerned if you're willing to go for used market choices. The same could be said, I guess, for the CPU, but I think the 5700X3D is a pretty well-rounded chip overall. I don't think you can go too far wrong, and you can actually find some better deals on sites like AliExpress as well if you want to wait a while longer for it to turn up. But yeah, it's a pretty good chip. The 4060 is quite controversial, does split opinions. I think as it drops in price a little more, it is a little more tempting. I'm not too concerned with 8GB of RAM considering where the 4060 sits in Nvidia's tier list, but for me personally, it's the price that's the main problem still. Still needs to come down a little bit, but it's not a bad card really, especially if you're gaming at 1080p, and you can even get away with 1440p if you manage your expectations, to put it lightly, as far as the settings are concerned. But thanks for watching, let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you next time.